The story of Wali the Simple-Hearted. Once upon a time there lived a poor old man whose name was Wali Gunjay, or Wali the Bald. He had no relations, but lived all by himself in a little mud hut some distance from any towns, and made his living by cutting grass in the jungle and selling it as fodder for horses. He only earned about 5 halfpence a day, but he was a simple old man and needed so little out of it that he saved up 1 halfpenny daily, and spent the rest upon food and clothing as he required. In this way he lived for many years, until one night he thought that he would count the money he had hidden away in the great earthen pot under the floor of his hut. So he set to work, and with much trouble he pulled the bag out of the floor, and sat gazing in astonishment at the heap of coins which had tumbled out of it. What should he do with all of them, he wondered. But he never thought of spending the money on himself, because he was content to pass the rest of his days as he had been doing for so long, and he really had no desire of any great comfort or luxury. At last he threw all the money into an old sack, which he pushed under his bed, then rolled in his ragged old blanket and went to sleep. Early next morning he staggered off with a sack of money to the shop of a jeweler whom he knew to be in town, and bargained with him for a little gold bracelet. With this carefully wrapped up in cotton waistband, he went to the house of a rich friend, who was a traveling merchant and used to wander about with his camels and merchandise through many countries. Wali was lucky enough to find him at home, so he sat down, and after a little talk, he asked the merchant who was the most virtuous and beautiful lady he had ever met with. The merchant replied that the Princess of Kazakhstan was renowned everywhere for her beauty of a person, as well as for the kindness and generosity of her disposition. "Well," said Wali, "next time you go that way, give her this little bracelet, with the respectful compliments of one who admires virtue far more than he desires wealth." With that he pulled the bracelet from his waistband and handed it to his friend. The merchant was naturally astonished, but said nothing, and made no objection to carrying out his friend's plan. Time passed by, and at length the merchant arrived in the course of his travels to the capital of Kazakhstan. As soon as he had the opportunity, he presented himself at the palace, and sent in the bracelet, neatly packed in a little perfumed box provided by himself, giving at the same time the message entrusted to him by Wali. The princess could not think who could have bestowed this present on her, but she bade her servant to tell the merchant that if he would return after he had finished his business in the room, she would give him her reply. In a few days, therefore, the merchant came back and received from the princess a return present in the shape of a camel-load of rich silks, besides a present of money for himself. With these he set out on his journey. Some months later he got home again from his journeyings, and proceeded to take Wali the princess's present. Great was the perplexity of the good man to find a camel-load of silks tumbled at his door. What was he to do with these costly things? But presently, after much thought, he begged the merchant to consider whether he did not know some young prince to whom such treasures might be useful. "Of course," cried the merchant, greatly amused. "From Delhi to Baghdad, and from Constantinople to Lucknow, I know them all, and there lives none worthier than the gallant and wealthy young prince of Nakabad." "Very well, then, take the silks to him, with the blessing of an old man," said Wali, much relieved to be rid of them. So the next time the merchant journeyed that way, he carried the silks with him, and in due course he arrived at Nekabad, and sought an audience with the prince. When he was shown into the presence he produced the beautiful gift of silks that Wali had sent, and begged the young man to accept them as a humble tribute of his worth and greatness. The prince was much touched by the generosity of the giver, and ordered, as a return present, 12 of the finest breed of horses for which his country was famous to be delivered over to the merchant, who also, before he took his leave, gave a magnificent reward for his services. As before, the merchant at last arrived at home, and next day he set out to Wali house with the 12 horses. When the old man saw them coming in the distance, he said to himself, "What luck! A troop of horses is coming. They will want quantities of grass, and I shall set all I have without having to drag to market." Thereupon he rushed off and cut grass as fast as he could. When he got back with as much grass as he could possibly carry, he was greatly discomfited to find out that the horses were all for himself. At first he could not think what to do with them, but after a little, a brilliant idea struck him. He gave two to the merchant and begged him to take the rest to the Princess of Kazakhstan, who was clearly the fittest person to possess such beautiful animals. The merchant departed, laughing, but true to his old friend's request, he took the horses with him on his next journey, and eventually presented them safely to the princess. This time the princess sent for the merchant and questioned him about the giver. Now the merchant was usually a most honest man, but he did not quite like to describe Wali Dad in his true light as an old man whose income was 5 halfpence a day, and who hardly had clothes to cover him. So he told her that his friend had heard stories of her beauty and goodness, and had longed to lay the best he had at her feet. The princess then took her father into her confidence, and begged him to advise her what courtesy she might return to one who persisted in making such presents. "Well," said the king, "you cannot refuse them, so the best thing you can do is to send this unknown friend at once a present so magnificent that he is not likely to be able to send you anything better, and so will be ashamed to send you anything at all." Then he ordered that, in place of each of the 10 horses, 2 mules laden with silver should be returned by her. Thus, in a few hours, the merchant found himself in charge of a splendid caravan, and he had to hire a number of armed men to defend it on the road against robbers, and he was glad indeed to find himself back again in Wali Dad's hut. "Well now," cried Wali Dad as he viewed the wealth laid at his door, "I can well repay this kind prince for the magnificent present of the horses, but to be sure you have put on great expenses. Still, if you will accept 6 mules and their loads, will take the rest straight to Nakabad, I will thank you heartily." The merchant felt handsomely repaid for his trouble, and wondered greatly how the matter would turn out. So he made no difficulty about it, and as soon as he could get things ready, set out for Nekabad with his new and princely gift. This time the prince, too, was embarrassed, and questioned the merchant closely. The merchant felt that his credit was at stake, and so, whilst inwardly determining that he should not carry the joke on any further, he could not help describing Wali Dad in such glowing terms that the old man would never have known himself had he heard them. The prince, like the king of Kazakhstan, determined that he would send in return a gift that would be truly royal, and which would perhaps prevent the unknown giver sending him any more. So he made up a caravan of 20 splendid horses, caparisoned with gold-embroidered cloth, with fine Morocco sandals and silver bridles and stirrups. Also 20 camels of the best breed, which had the speed of racehorses and could swing along at the trot all day without getting tired. And lastly 20 elephants with magnificent silver howdahs and coverings of silk embroidered with pearls. To take care of these animals, the merchant hired a little army of men, and a troop made a great show as they traveled along. When Wali Dad from the distance saw a cloud of dust which the caravan made, and the glitter of its appointments, he said to himself, "By Allah, there's a grand crowd coming! Elephants, too! Grass will be selling well today!" And with that he hurried off to the jungle and cut grass as fast as he could. As soon as he got back he found the caravan had stopped at his door, and the merchant was waiting, a little anxiously, to tell him the news and to congratulate him on his riches. "Riches?" cried Walidad. "What has an old man like me with 1 foot in the grave to do with riches? That beautiful princess, now. She'd be the one to enjoy all these fine things. Do you take for yourself 2 horses, 2 camels, and 2 elephants with all their trappings, and present the rest to her." The merchant at first objected to these remarks, and pointed out to Walidad that he was beginning to feel embassies a little awkward. Of course, he found himself richly repaid, so far as expenses went, but he still did not like going so often, and he was getting nervous. At length, however, he consented to go once more, but he promised himself never to embark on another such enterprise. So a few days' rest, the caravan started off once more to Kazakhstan. The moment the king of Kazakhstan saw the gorgeous train of men and beasts entering his palace courtyard, he was so amazed he hurried down in person to inquire about it, and became dumb when he heard that all these were a present from the princely Walidad, and were for the princess, his daughter. He went off hastily to her apartments and said to her, "I tell you what it is, my dear. That man wants to marry you. That is the meaning of all these presents. There is nothing for it but to go and pay him a visit in person. You must be a man of immense wealth, and since so devoted to you, perhaps you might do worse than marry him." The princess agreed with all that her father said, and orders were issued for vast numbers of elephants, camels, and gorgeous tents and flags, and litters for the ladies and horses for the men to be prepared without delay, as the king and the princess were going to pay a visit to the great and magnificent Prince Wali. The merchant, the king declared, was to guide the party. The feelings of the poor merchant in the sore dilemma can hardly be imagined. Willingly he would have run away, but he was treated with such hospitality as Walidad's representative that he hardly got an instant's real peace, and never had an opportunity to slip him away. In fact, after a few days, despair possessed him to such a degree that he made up his mind that all that happened was fate, and that escape was impossible. But he hoped devoutly to turn some fortune that would reveal to him a way of the difficulties which he had, with the best intentions, drawn upon himself. On the seventh day they all started, amidst thunderous salutes from the ramparts of the city, and much dust and cheering and blaring of trumpets. Day after day they moved on, and every day the poor merchant fell more ill and miserable. He wondered what kind of death the king would invent for him, and went almost as much torture as he lay awake the whole of every night, thinking of his situation, as he would have suffered if the king's executioners were already setting work upon his neck. At last they were only a day's march from Wali Dad's little mud home. Here a great encampment was made, and the merchant was sent on to tell Wali Dad that the king and princess of Kazakhstan had arrived and were seeking an interview. When the merchant arrived, he found the poor old man eating his evening meal of onions and dry bread, and when he told him of all that had happened, he had not the heart to proceed to load him with the reproaches which rose to his tongue. For Wali Dad was overwhelmed with grief and shame for himself, for his friend, and for the name of honor of the princess, and he wept and plucked at his beard and groaned quite piteously. With tears he begged the merchant to detain them for one day by any kind of excuse he could think of, and to come in the morning to discuss what they should do. As soon as the merchant was gone, Wali Dad made up his mind that there was only one honorable way out of the shame and distress that had created by his foolishness, and that was to kill himself. So, without stopping to ask for anyone's advice, he went off in the middle of the night to a place where the river wound along at the base of a steep, rocky cliffs of great height, and determined to throw himself down and put an end to his life. When he got to the place, he drew back a few breaths and took a little run. At the very edge of that grateful black gulf he stopped short. He could not do it. From below, unseen in the blackness and the deep night shadows, the water roared and boiled around jagged rocks. He could picture the place as he knew it, only 10 times more pitiless and foreboding in the visionless darkness. The wind soughed through the gorge with fearsome sighs and rustlings and whisperings, and the bushes and grasses that grew on the ledges of the cliff seemed to him like living creatures that danced and beckoned, shadowing him as things. An owl laughed, "Ooh, ooh," almost in his face, as he peered over the edge of the gulf. The old man threw himself back in a perspiration of horror. He was afraid. He drew back shuddering and covering his face with his hands and wept aloud. Presently he was aware of a gentle radiance that shed itself before him. Surely the morning was not already coming to hasten and reveal his disgrace. He took his hands from before his face, and before him saw 2 lovely beings whom his instinct told him were not mortal, but were fairies from paradise. "Why do you weep, old man?" said one, in a voice clear and as musical as bubble. "I weep for shame." "What do you do here?" questioned the other. "I came here to die," said Wali Dad, and as they questioned him, he confessed all his story. Then he first stepped forward and laid his hand upon the shoulder, and Wali Dad began to feel that something strange, what he did not know, was happening to him. His old cotton rags of clothes were changed to the beautiful linens and embroidered cloth. On his hard, bare feet were warm, soft shoes, and on his head a great jeweled turban. Round his neck there lay a heavy golden chain, and his little old bent sickle, which he cut grass with, which hung from his waistband. It turned into a gorgeous scimitar, whose ivory hilt gleamed in the pale light like snow in the moonlight. As he stood there wondering, like a man in a dream, the other Peri waved her hand and bade him turn and see. And lo, before him a noble gateway stood open. Up in an avenue, giant trees placed the Peris led him, dumb with amazement. At the end of the avenue, on the very spot where his hut had stood, a gorgeous palace appeared. It blazed with a myriad of lights, and its great porticos and verandas were occupied by hurrying servants. Guards paced to and fro and saluted him respectfully as he drew near. Along mossy walks and through sweepy grassy lawns were fountains playing and flowers scented the air. Wali stood stunned and helpless. "Fear not," said one of the fairies. "Go to your house and learn that God rewards simple-hearted." With these words, they both disappeared and left him. He walked on, thinking still that he must be dreaming. Very soon he retired to rest in a splendid room, far grander than anything he had ever dreamed of. When morning dawned, he awoke, and found that the palace, and himself, and his servants were all real, and that he was not dreaming after all. If he was dumbfounded, the merchant, who was ushered into his presence soon after sunrise, was more so. He told Wali he had not slept all night. By the first streak of daylight he started out to seek his old friend. And what a search he had had! A great stretch of wild jungle country had, in the night, changed into parks and gardens, and if it had not been for some of Wali new servants who found him and brought him to the palace, he would have fled away under the impression that trouble had been sent him crazy, and that was only his imagination. Then Wali told the merchant all that had happened. By his advice he sent an invitation to the king and princes of Kazakhstan to come and be his guests, together with a retinue of servants, down to the very humblest in the camp. For 3 nights and days a great feast was held in honor of the royal guests, and every evening the king and his nobles were served on golden plates from golden cups, and the smaller people in silver plates and silver cups, and each evening each guest was requested to keep the plates and cups they had used as a remembrance of the occasion. Never had anything so splendid been seen. Besides the great dinners, there were all sports and hunting, and dances and amusements of all sorts. On the 4th day the king of Kazakhstan took his host aside, and asked him whether it was true, as he suspected, that he wished to marry his daughter. But Wali after thanking him very much for the compliment, said that he had never dreamed of so great an honor, and that he was far too old and ugly for so fair a lady. But he begged the king to stay with him until he could send for the Prince of Nekabad, who was a most excellent, brave, and honorable young man, and who would surely be delighted to try to win the hand of a beautiful princess. The king agreed, and Wali sent the merchant to Nekabad with a number of attendants, and with such handsome presents that the prince came at once, fell head over ears in love with the princess, and married her at Wali palace amidst the fresh outbursts of rejoicings. And now the king of Kazakhstan and the prince and princess of Nekabad each went back to their own country, and Wali lived to a good old age, befriending all who were in trouble and preserving in his prosperity the simple-hearted, generous nature that he had when he was only Wali Gunjay, the grass cutter.